Howdy y'all, next lesson, technical difficulty fixed. Chapter 4, correction, Chapter 5, Lesson 4, the Principles of the Constitution. Very important lesson, maybe not the most fun one, but definitely packed full of knowledge that you need to know and need to retain for the EOC. The good part about this information is you're going to hear these principles over and over again. Some we've already talked about. Others we're going to reinforce and hear again when we talk about the branches of government, the powers of the branches of government, the powers of the states, and we'll also talk about a lot of these basic principles of the Constitution when we cover our basic rights we have, when we look at the Bill of Rights, and other important amendments, particularly those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So, principles of the Constitution. You've heard these before, and we'll see them again. The first one, popular sovereignty. Sovereignty means having power, popular, buyer of the people. Popular sovereignty, power belongs to the people. We've talked about this before, and the question you get to think EOC-wise is, Abby, Vladimir, your friend from Russia, is learning some U.S. civics, and he says to you, Abigail, prove to me this concept of popular sovereignty. If people have the power, how do you see that? Prove to me it exists.
By voting.
Voting is the single answer you got to keep in your brain. We prove that the people have the power and the right to rule. What did I do with that font there? That's all messed up. People have the right to rule, and you can prove that in our government because we vote, right? I vote for all my local politicians, from council people to mayors, up to my state politicians like the governors, to my federal government, my national politicians. Who do I get to vote for in my national government? I get to vote for one congressman who represent Western Florida. I get to vote for two senators who represent the state, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, and I get to vote for one president who represents the entire country. So that's where I have power. That's how important. That proves that our system has as one of its principles popular sovereignty. Sometimes you'll see different lists. How many principles are there? Are there 5, there's 6, there's 7? Depends. One of the things that confuses us is our book adds these two together. Limited government and rule of law. They're similar but not the same. Limited government is a very critical principle of our government. Limited government goes back to the whole federalist, anti-federalist argument we had when creating the idea of our government system. Limited government basically says government should and can only do those things it's permitted to do. It shouldn't be wide-ranging power, and government should not be doing things government shouldn't do. The way we protect our freedom from tyranny is by limiting the scope and the power and the scale of government. Limited government, one of our basic principles. One of the things that limits the power of our government is this idea of rule of law. That every citizen, to include every politician, up to and including the President of the United States, is subordinate to, or is second to, or has to follow the law. The ideal of rule of law, in its most perfect way, would be everybody has to follow the law, from a homeless person living on the street, some of the most least powerful people in our nation, to the most powerful people in our nation. Senators, presidents, Supreme Court justices, etc. That the law applies equally to all, and all have to follow and respect the law. Arguably, if you do not have rule of law, you're basically a dictatorship or a tyranny. If I go to jail for breaking the law and the president doesn't, you could argue that that's not the ideals and principles of what America's all about. Limited government, rule of law, are they separate? Are they together? Maybe confusingly, our book kind of lumps those two together. Some quotes and ideas about rule of law and limited government. which is the political party that you would say is stronger about, or is really more about limiting the government of power, at least in their platform, at least the stuff they say? Which of the two major parties is really the party of small government, contained government, limited government?
Republicans.
The Republicans would say that's typically part of their party platform. The government needs to be small and contained and controlled and shouldn't be doing all kinds of stuff. The Democrats, on the other side, while they still believe in the idea of limited government, see a bigger, broader role for government. To me, the easiest thing you see in maybe your own lives and conversations is healthcare. Typically, Republicans would argue that healthcare is something that people have to deal with on their own, where a Democrat, more progressive viewpoint would be the government should take more on itself of providing healthcare for its citizens. Oh yeah, Jefferson's quote here is pretty good. And again, it's straight to the idea of limited government and to rule of law. He argues if you have a government that's powerful enough to do sort of all kinds of stuff, one of the things that government can do is take away your rights. So Jefferson was really about small, limited government. It's interesting when you look at Jefferson's presidency, sometimes he keeps to this. He was against national banking systems, which made him a big enemy of Hamilton. He was against a big army. He did things to keep the army small. He was against a big navy. He did things to keep the navy small. Because his idea was if your government was too big, all it's going to do is take away from your rights. Was he always consistent in this? No. One of the best examples is he bought almost half the country from Emperor Napoleon in France from the called the Louisiana Purchase. He said that was illegal. He did not have the power to do it, but he did it anyway because it was such a good deal, and how could you pass it up? Good quote from Kennedy too, one of our presidents. We talk about Kennedy in the beginning of the year. We talked about the demographics of presidents. Demographics is things like age, nationality, race, religious background. What's President Kennedy's demographic claim to fame? Up until this 2020 election, he was the first president who was
What?
Roman Catholic.
Oh.
Every other president we've had has been Protestant. He is different demographically because he was our only Roman Catholic president. That changes in 2020. President-elect Biden's also Roman Catholic background. Yeah. Rule of law or rule of force. If you're an authoritarian regime or you're a dictatorship, you don't follow rule of law. You're all about rule of force. You have power, so you exert it over your citizens. In our ideal society, in our ideal vision of the Constitution, that government does not exert its force over the people, and it follows and respects rule of law. That's why we could have things like safe and efficient elections. When you elect somebody, you know that person's going to say, oh, I get it. I lost the election, so I will no longer be president, and I will help the new president transition into power, because that's what functioning democracies that respect the rule of law do. An authoritarian dictatorship, you lose an election, which is probably rigged and has major problems with it. The dictator says, no, I don't like the results of that election. I think I'm just going to stay in power. Good quote by Kennedy about rule of law. And I think apropos to current events today. Separation of powers. 3 branches. Each branch has its own set of powers. Why? Because of Baron de Montesquieu's great idea that you split your government into branches so no branch becomes so powerful that it could become tyrannical and then take away your life and your liberties and your freedoms. Always connect that in your brain with good old Baron de Montesquieu, or as we call him, Baron de Mosquito, or the Mosquito guy. Do you have to know how to spell it? No. But you need to be able to recognize that name, Montesquieu, and hook it up with this concept of separation of powers. That he's one of the key thinkers that provides ideas to Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison to create the government we have. That's why we spend so much time learning about good old mosquito guy.
Mosquitoes separate your blood from your body.
Yes, they do.
That's a way to remember it.
You could use.
I'm giving a little.
You could use that.
Yeah.
I'll have to think about that one a little more.
You have to come up with something so they can learn it better.
You're here at a birth of an idea. This is the first I've ever thought of mosquitoes separating blood from your body. And maybe I'll start using that as a teaching technique for the next, I don't know, I'm going to have to teach for the next 25 years so I can feed my kids. So we'll see how that works out. Separation powers, though, critical. Something you need to know. One of those core principles of our government and our Constitution. Link it to the idea of the French Enlightenment philosopher Baron de Montesquieu. Bet you a cinnamon Pop-Tart, that's going to be on our EOC. And as far as I know, we're still having one in this year of COVID. Checks and balances. You can confuse the ideas of checks and balances and separation of powers because both are based on the idea of we do have three separate branches. Separation of powers, you have three separate branches that do different things, that have their own powers and responsibilities, and the key idea is each branch can prevent the other branches from becoming too strong, because that would be a threat to our liberty. Checks and balances are the ideas that not only are they separate, but they can actually do stuff to stop those other branches. Critical, you need to know these. This will be, again, another EOC question. I bet you a cinnamon Pop-Tart and a Pizza Hot Pocket that you will see checks and balances and separation of powers in there, and they may deliberately try to put those together in a way that confuses you so you can prove your knowledge that you know the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers, Montesquieu, three branches, each has its own responsibilities. Checks and balances is this whole system where each branch has certain powers to physically stop, limit what another branch does. In the class, we'll go through pretty much all of them in detail. Right now, this is just an overview, but some of the things up here, for example, the legislative branch, what's its primary power? If the legislative branch does one thing over everything else, what does it do?
They make the laws.
It makes laws. So given that that's the key power of the legislative branch, how would you check that power?
By having someone who can say, no, we don't think you should make that power.
Exactly, and who is that?
The president.
The president. The president has the power to stop laws from being made by the power of the veto. If the president likes the law, the president signs it, and now it's an effective law. If the president doesn't like it, he says, no, I veto. That's an example of one of those checks.
And can't the judicial branch reverse the veto and be like, never mind, your no is not a no?
No, the judicial branch cannot reverse a president's veto. The legislative branch can reverse the president's veto by voting again and overriding his veto, but that's very rare.
I guess my question is, the legislative branch, if they're the ones that create the law and they pass it in the first place to send it to the president, and he was like, no, wouldn't most of the time they would just reverse the veto because they agreed to it in the first place, and they're probably not going to have, if that's something they really want to do.
They can override the veto, but the devil is in the details, and here's the detail. To change a bill into a law, Congress only needs a simple majority in both houses. To override a veto, they need a 2/3 majority.
Oh, okay.
And with the two-party political system we have, you don't always have that 2/3 majority of your own party. And the way things are today, recent history, just about everything's happening on pure party lines. So if you have a Democratic president and a Republican Senate, it's hard to get everything in line to make these things work smoothly. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, where the judicial branch would check the legislative branch, or both branches, let's say the legislative branch comes up with a bill, signs it, makes a law, gives it to the president, he says, I love this, and signs it into a law. How does the judicial branch stop that?
Take it to court.
It goes to the judicial branch and it goes to the Supreme
they
Court, and the
argue over
Supreme
it?
Court can say it's what?
Unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional. Good job, Abby. That's the Supreme Court's big job and big check. These two branches can say, yep, this is the law, we love it, it's awesome. The new law is women can't vote. President thinks that's groovy, Congress loves that, they sign that into a law. New law, women can't vote. The check, of course, the judicial branch would have, and the Supreme Court at its top would say, that is unconstitutional. It violates the 19th Amendment, which says women have the right to vote. So you can't have that law. Supreme Court erases it by declaring it unconstitutional. Good job as usual, Abby. You got this stuff down. Little more explanation. Put that slide in there specifically because I've seen it and it's an EOC. It's not really a trick, but just a way to prove you know what you're talking about. Further explaining the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances, because they are similar, they are related, but they aren't the same. Checks and balances, separation of powers. Check this out when you're going through this presentation, like I know you will. Federalism, another key principle of the Constitution. We've talked about federalism at least twice before. It's the idea that in our system of government, there's a power-sharing arrangement with three different levels. At the top level is what?
The national government.
The national government or the federal government. Congress, President, Supreme Court, federal government at the top. In the middle, who's got the power in the middle?
The state government.
50 state governments. Each state has its own government. And they all look like the federal government in a way. They all Montesquieu 3 branches. They all have a executive branch, which is not run by a president, who's the head of an executive branch in a state.
The governor.
Governor. They all have their own legislatures, typically in their state capitals. So our legislature is in Tallahassee, Florida. And what does our state legislature do? It represents the people and has the major job of making laws. So it makes Florida laws. Like a couple votes back, they had a new law that people got to vote on, and it was outlawing dog racing. So Florida passed a law to outlaw dog racing. Was that a federal law passed by Congress in Washington, D.C.? No. That was a state law passed by our elected legislatures in our state government in our capital in Tallahassee, Florida.
It was passed?
It was.
Oh.
That was 2018 vote. And finally, you have a state judicial branch with state courts. What do state courts do? Focus on legal issues that are state law. Whether it's civil, lawsuits, or criminal, cops lock you up and put you in jail. Each state has its own state laws. Cool. But in the idea of federalism is, those state laws can't violate the
Government laws, like the federal laws.
federal laws and the Constitution. So the state can do pretty much whatever it wants, make its own laws. That's why each state is a little bit different. But it can't go to the point where it violates federal law. And finally, the government closest to you. The book has a number and it's big and I can't remember what it is. It's like 70,000 local governments. Those are your cities, your townships, your counties, your whatever else. The small government's closest to you. Can they have their own executive branches? Yes. Typically, the head of the executive branch in a city or town is called a
Counselor.
It can be. depending on exactly how that state government's set up, but a little more common. If you're not the councilor of the city of New York, you're the, starts with an M.
Mayor.
Mayor. Your head of your executive branch in a city is typically a mayor. Small government gets weird. Some don't even have mayors, so your councilors, your councilmen are your biggest
What's the
representatives.
difference between a councilor and a mayor?
This gets in a little bit
Is
too
that
much.
even smaller? Is a councilor
Small
smaller
government-
than a mayor?
Small government is a little strange. Some cities have mayors, and they're the head of that city's executive branch, and you think of them as a mini governor or president. But not all cities are like that. Some of those cities, the mayor is just one person on the city council, which acts like both an executive and legislative branch at times. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And here's one that really blows your mind. You ready for this? Some cities don't have a mayor. They have a city councilor who hire a city manager, who kind of acts like a mayor, but nobody gets to vote for. They get actually like hired as a job by city council to make it even more confusing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We'll keep that out of it for right now.
So, is it just like cities, or just any town has a mayor or a councilor?
I would say just use the word local instead of a city, because local comprises cities, townships, counties. In New Orleans, they call them parishes, and they're not all the same.
So, Milton doesn't have its own government, but like Pensacola,
Milton does have its own government, and it has a city council and a mayor.
Does Pace have a government?
Pace doesn't have a government.
Wow.
Or it doesn't have a big government like Milton. We have basically city commissioners that we get to elect. Why? There's a bunch of whys. First is the preferences of the people, and the second is history. Like Milton is old. The city of Milton has been around forever. Pace is relatively new. And the only other detail level I want to go into is it's the state that has the power of setting up local governments. So the state of Florida basically grants the people in different parts of Florida, oh, you want to create your own city or township? Sure. And then to make it even more complicated, we have these things called counties. So both Pace and Milton are part of Santa Rosa County, which has its own government. Yeah. You get down to local government, it could get extremely confusing, and it could get pretty crazy. Just the small governments here in Pace and Milton. Like once upon a time, we had this mayor in Milton that was mayor of Milton like 40 years straight. He was like the mayor forever until finally, history teacher worked for Hobbs Middle School, West Meese, beat him in an election, and he became the mayor.
So there's no like limit on how long they can be mayor for?
Not
There's
the
no-
mayor of Milton, no. There's
Yeah.
no like, of course, presidents have the
Yeah.
22nd Amendment they gotta follow, so they only serve 2 terms. But this guy literally served like, as mayor for 40 years. And do you wanna know what happened after he was no longer the mayor?
What, he died?
No. He was in charge of this big charity, the United Way, and the FBI investigated him and arrested him because he stole like $300,000 from this charity.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wait, okay, one last question. So what's the difference between what the state government would do and what like a county government would do or a local government would do? Because it seems like they would just be getting into the semantics of things, like.
Sometimes, and we'll get into this when we look at the powers that each level of government have. For example, each level of government has its own laws, which means it has its own law enforcement, which means it has its own prison systems. So, City of Milton has its own laws, it has its own police. Even though it's sitting in the middle of Santa Rosa County, which has its own laws and it has its own police, they just call it the Sheriff's Department, which is sitting in the state of Florida, which has its own laws, which has its own police, which is part of the United States. which has its own law, which has its own police.
So do the laws get
Federal
more
police.
specific as it goes down?
They
'Cause
can.
They can't really violate the laws that are above it, so they have to get more and more
They
specific.
can. It's not only more specific, it's more specific. For example, there's some criminal stuff. It's not going to be changed much. It's going to be a Florida statute. Milton, I don't think, has its own statutes on murder.
Yeah.
It just follows the Florida statutes. Milton, though, would have its own laws regarding how Milton does elections, how Milton taxes, how Milton assesses taxes, things like that. Because we're going to see, guess what each layer of government can also do to you? Tax you. And we'll get to that here. What you need to know for now, that federalism is one of the key principles of the government. It's power sharing between a federal, state, and local system. And what we're going to get to is some powers only the national government can do. They are solely delegated to the national and federal level. So what are some powers of government that only the national government can do, do you think, Abby?
Like, make treaties with like other
Make-
countries.
Absolutely. Make treaties with foreign countries. What do you think something else that only the federal government can do?
War.
Declare war. You don't want Missouri declaring war against Japan.
No.
You don't want Florida declaring war against Cuba. That would be ridiculous. Another big one, who gets to print money?
Yeah.
The federal government has the power to print money. State and local governments can't. Because they used to in America under the Articles of Confederation. And can you imagine now, you're like, well, I got Florida bucks and I got to go to Alabama. Oh man, I can't spend my Florida bucks in Alabama because they use Alabama dollars. And then I go to Georgia and they have Georgia pounds. So I got to convert it, and it's like going to a foreign country. Only the national government can do that, all right? Some powers are reserved only for the state government. So what's a state government only power that the national government does not have the power to do?
Like schooling.
Schooling.
things?
It's the one that always comes up. It's the easiest because let's face it, we're here. Donald Trump does not make the laws and the rules regulating how you're educated in Florida. So if you hate Mr. Biankowski, you think he's a terrible teacher, that's cool. But don't call the president up and saying, whoever it is, depending on when you call, President Biden, this clown Biankowski's horrible, you gotta fire him. It's not a federal power, it's a state issue. Then you have these shared or concurrent powers. These are powers that are shared amongst the levels of government. That's like law enforcement. Pretty much everybody can have their own cops, which means they have their own jails or prisons, all right? They all can tax you, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does get complicated. Local government specifically gets super complicated and is very specific to place. Local government in a big city like Philadelphia or New York is completely different than local government here in Milton or Santa Rosa County. But the big things they do for local government is they're typically taking care of most of your streets and roads. You have your own police, fire, emergency services, and a lot of the ordinances that affect you on a daily basis, like your taxes and things like, I want to start a business, local and state government, you really have to worry about things like that. I want to build a house. Who do you care about? Local government makes almost of your zoning laws and things like that.
This is really specific, but like water towers, is that like a local government thing?
Yes, yes. And some, again, to make it even more confusing, some are run by local government, where the government actually owns that system, but also common is they don't own it and they hire somebody to do it. So as far as I know, in Pace, the government just hires this company saying, all right, run the water. So this company of just normal citizens, they run the water. In other places, like a big city, typically you would have the city that's actually running the water system. That's how it was in Philadelphia when I grew up. Your water came from the city of Philadelphia, which had its own processing plants, it had its own employees. Here in Pace, they hired a company and they say, all right, company, here's money. Your job is to run the water system. Make sense?
Yeah.
It gets complicated. Federalism, need to know that. 3 types of power. Here's something that's new, and it's linked to the idea of federalism, all right? Where do you get your power from Is it specific to the Constitution? Can you see it in black and white? If it is, that's an enumerated power. That's given specifically to the government in black and white. You could read it in the Constitution today. You go to the National Archives, you peer in there, you look at Article 2, and it says, oh, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. There's no doubt about it. It's there. It's enumerated. It's in the black and white, and it says it is directly for the federal government owned. Reserve powers, that's everything else. That's set aside for the states. It's not in the Constitution. It's not directly given to the national government, so the states get it. Schools, marriage laws, divorce laws, custody laws. It's not in the Constitution. You won't find the word school in the United States Constitution. So that power is reserved to the states. Concurrent, shared by both. So again, policing functions. Milton has his own police, black and white cars. Santa Rosa County Sheriffs has their own police, green and white, guys in the green uniforms. State has its own police. The black and tan cars, the guys wear sort of tannish, Florida Highway Patrol. And then federal law enforcement, which is a lot of stuff, but typically you think of federal law enforcement, I think of the
CIA.
That's an intelligence agency, that's different. FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, that's federal cops. They enforce federal law. They work for the United States government.
So CIA is not a federal government branch?
It is. The CIA is a part of the federal government, but it's not law enforcement. It's intelligence.
So is enumerated powers, is that like a synonym to delegated powers?
No.
What's the difference?
A delegated power would be something you give that power to somebody else. Does that make sense?
But on the list it says held by national government.
Yes. The enumerated powers are written in the Constitution and specifically given to the national or federal government.
But that's what delegated powers is too.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, this other slide, now I see what you're talking about. You will sometimes see some different terminology, and that is one of the ways you'll see it, yes. Delegated powers, in this slide, is the same thing as enumerated. Yes.
Just as a tip, because I've taken lots of history exams already, and I've probably taken this one, they're going to ask about delegated powers, not enumerated powers. I've never heard that term. So if they ask that question, it's going to be delegated powers.
That's good to know. And I'm sad that our textbook, because our textbook really hits enumerated powers. Here's something that will help you. Civics is not only just civics, it's a reading test and it's a vocabulary test. If you know that enumerated basically means numbered, think of something that's listed as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Enumerated is anything that's clearly listed in a list of numbers. So this is clearly listed on paper as stuff that belongs to the federal government. And the way I guess you could link that to delegated powers is, if I delegate power to you, that's me as the teacher, and I say, okay, I'm giving you, Abby, the power to grade my tests. Here, it's the Constitution saying to the President and Congress and the judicial branch, here's your powers, this is what you could do. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. That's the first time I've heard that.
Really?
Yeah, I need to think more about that delegated powers. Again, enumerated, it's stuff that's actually listed in black and white. It's not implied, it's in there. So big ones for Congress, they get to coin money. Big ones for Congress, they get to declare war. Big ones for Congress, they're supposed to fund and maintain an army and navy. You don't have to guess about it, it's written in black and white. Reserve powers, they go to the states. This one says check out the 10th Amendment because that's where this power comes from. The 10th Amendment's the last one in the Bill of Rights, and it basically says this. Every possible power you could think of that is not directly given to the federal government goes to the states. It's a cool amendment. 9th Amendment's pretty cool too. It says, any rights not specifically in the Bill of Rights are held by the people in the states. So like these two blanket cover-all amendments.
Is that why there's like super weird laws, like you can't put an ice cream cone in your pocket?
Yes. And we talked about this before with another lesson somewhere along the line. Yeah. The 10th Amendment says, hey, state governments, if it's not specifically given to the federal government, you could do it. So if you want to tax pigs or not let people walk around with ice cream cones in their pockets, that's where you get these wacky, usually local, but sometimes state laws.
Why would someone make that law?
I don't know. Because humans are strange.
I wonder if it was like a trend at some point and it was causing a public nuisance.
It can be a trend, it could be public nuisances. Sometimes these things deal with business and money and regulation. So a lot of these laws would be to kind of like restrict certain businesses or people doing certain things to protect businesses that already exist. Some of those really weird laws are like that.
Yeah.
Now, you always have the power to do what? A lawsuit, challenge that law in court. And if it gets all the way up to the Supreme Court can decide that law is unconstitutional. Usually what happens though is local or state legislatures just get rid of them over time, or the other thing they do is, which is the easiest thing, they just never enforce them.
Yeah.
So nobody ever sues them. So the cop never arrests you for walking around with an ice cream cone in your pocket like you do all the time.
Yeah.
So you're never in jail, so you're never motivated to sue the government, so it never gets to the Supreme Court. They're like, that's a violation of Abigail's 9th and 14th Amendment rights. Even though it doesn't say in the Constitution you have the right to walk around with an ice cream cone in your pocket. Because, of course, Hamilton and Madison would never have thought of that ever in their lives. But Hamilton and Madison were smart enough to say, all right, you're going to force me to have a Bill of Rights. I am going to stick this in your face, the 9th and 10th Amendments that basically say every right that we haven't thought of, you have. And the 10th Amendment is every power that we didn't give to the federal government, the people in the states have. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Drinking age, school stuff, marriage age. You know there's some states with no lower limit on marriage ages?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's weird.
But it's a state right.
But pedophilia is illegal.
Yes.
How is an adult marrying a very underage minor not illegal? I
don't
guess
know.
that's my question.
I don't know how states get around that. I assume that their laws are written that as long as you're married, it's no longer a crime. I know. It does seem strange. Concurrent powers, powers that are shared by federal and state local governments. Of course, taxation. Everybody wants to tax you. I am taxed by the city of Milton. I'm taxed by Santa Rosa County. I'm taxed by the state of Florida. And I am taxed, of course, by the federal government, the United States government. All right? In Milton, I pay some sort of property tax, same sort of thing with county. State, everything from driver's license to car registrations. And of course, the federal government, my major tax bill, you have to pay tax to the federal government at least once a year called federal income tax. Everybody needs money to operate, and the big place they get that money from is by taxing their citizens. So anybody can tax you. Concurrent powers, again, civics is not just civics, it's really reading and grammar and vocabulary. If you already know what the word concurrent means, it just means happening together at the same time. So it should be obvious that a concurrent power is something happening together at the same time. So concurrent power is things that federal, state, local governments can all do at the same time. Supremacy clause, we're getting to the end here. 6th Amendment of the Constitution says, hey, guess what? Constitution, federal law is at the top of the food chain. Yes, states, we told you you have your own powers, which includes make your own laws. Go nuts. But there's a limit. There's a box you can't come out of, and that's your laws can't violate the Constitution. They can't violate federal laws. I like this ladder here, and it kind of goes into what we were talking about earlier. It's not like general law here, and it gets more specific as it goes down lower to you, although in some ways you could say that. There's a hierarchy or supremacy. So, the city of Milton can pass a law, but the state or county can overrule it if it violates state or county laws. States have their own constitutions. They do. Each state has its own constitution, 50 of them. But that can't violate federal laws, and of course nothing could violate the Constitution. That's like your hierarchy. Pretty common sense. It should be intuitive, but really, understanding the supremacy clause is really understanding that, hey, look, the United States Constitution is at the top, nothing could violate the Constitution. Questions?
Nope.
This is day after Thanksgiving, 2020. Happy Thanksgiving.